The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan. Major Katerina Ghost, Volkov's F-15 strike Eagle sliced through the pre-dawn darkness at 38,000 feet, her twin Pratt and Whitney engines humming with deadly precision. Below, invisible in the black terrain, SEAL Team 6 was supposed to be extracting a high-value target. Instead, they were dying. Ghost Rider, this is Overwatch. We've lost contact with ground team. Last transmission indicated heavy contact, multiple KIA, RTB immediately. The voice of Colonel Marcus Webb carried the weight of defeat across the encrypted channel. Return to base. Mission abort. Another classified failure that would disappear into Pentagon filing cabinets. Katerina's gloved fingers tightened on the stick. Through her night vision display, she could see the thermal signatures blooming like deadly flowers across the valley floor. Muzzle flashes, explosions, the telltale heat signatures of men fighting for their lives against impossible odds. Her weapons systems officer, Captain James Radar Morrison, shifted nervously in the seat behind her. Ghost, we're getting painted by multiple SAM sites. This whole valley's a kill box. We need to get out of here. His voice carried the tremor of a man who'd seen too many friends die in these mountains. The same mountains that had swallowed her brother's Apache helicopter 3 years ago. The same mountains that had earned her the call sign, Ghost, not for her pale Slavic features or her ability to appear and disappear on radar, but for the haunted look in her green eyes after she'd returned from that search mission empty-handed. Command had written off the SEALs. Standard operating procedure when air support faced overwhelming anti-aircraft coverage. Better to lose 6 operators than risk a multi-million-dollar fighter jet and 2 highly trained aircrew. The mathematics of warfare, calculated in spreadsheets by men who'd never felt the heat of jet exhaust or smelled cordite in a cockpit. But Katerina Volkov hadn't survived 3 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan by following safe protocols. She'd earned her place in an F-15 cockpit not because the Air Force needed diversity statistics, but because she could thread a needle at Mach 2 and put ordnance on target when lesser pilots couldn't even find the battlefield. The daughter of a Russian immigrant mechanic who'd fled the Soviet Union with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn pride, she'd learned early that respect was earned through action, not given through sympathy. Radar, prep the targeting pod. We're going in. Her voice cut through the static like a blade through silk. Below them, American blood was soaking into Afghan soil while bureaucrats calculated acceptable losses. Colonel Webb's voice exploded through the radio. Negative, Ghost Rider. You are ordered to RTB immediately. The valley is too hot. Repeat, RTB now. The command carried the authority of eagles on shoulders and decades of military hierarchy, but authority meant nothing to the dead, and 6 Navy SEALs were about to join the ghosts that already haunted these peaks. Katerina's thumb hovered over the radio transmit button. One word would seal her fate and theirs. The pre-dawn sky stretched endlessly above them, stars fading as the first hint of sunrise painted the eastern horizon blood red. In that moment, suspended between heaven and earth, between orders and conscience, Major Katerina Volkov made the decision that would define the rest of her career. She clicked the transmit button twice, radio silence, the universal signal that meant, message received, cannot comply. The F-15 banked sharply left, diving toward the valley floor and the hell that waited below. Behind her, Captain Morrison muttered a prayer in Spanish, the language of his childhood before the Air Force Academy had polished away his accent. His hands danced across the weapons control panel, selecting ordnance with the practiced efficiency of a concert pianist. Hellfire missiles, 500-pound JDAMs, the 20mm Vulcan cannon with its devastating rate of fire. Ghost, I'm reading at least 12 heat signatures down there. Looks like they've got our guys pinned in a compound northwest corner of the valley. Heavy machine gun positions on the ridgeline, 2,000 meters east. Morrison's voice had steadied. professionalism overriding fear. Whatever personal reservations he'd harbored about flying with a female pilot had evaporated over 18 months of watching her thread their aircraft through situations that would have killed other crews. The altimeter unwound rapidly as they descended toward the mountains. 4,000 feet. 3,000. The threat warning system screamed in their headsets as multiple surface-to-air missile systems locked onto their aircraft. SA-7 Grails. SA-14 Gremlins. Older Soviet technology, but still deadly enough to turn an F-15 into scattered aluminum fragments across 30 square miles of mountainous terrain. Multiple locks, Morrison called out, his voice tight with concentration. Deploying chaff and flare. The aircraft shuddered as countermeasures ejected from their dispensers, creating a cloud of metallic strips and burning magnesium designed to confuse incoming missiles. Through her heads-up display, Katerina could see the thermal blooms of the decoys spreading like a deadly constellation against the mountain backdrop. The radio crackled with a new voice. Desperate, American, barely audible through static and the sound of automatic weapons fire. Any station, this is Neptune 6. We are taking heavy fire, multiple casualties, requesting immediate air support. Grid coordinates follow. The transmission dissolved into white noise, but Katerina had heard enough. Neptune 6 was the call sign of Lieutenant Commander Jake Trident Richardson, SEAL Team 6's commanding officer. She'd met Richardson 2 years earlier at Bagram Air Base, during a joint training exercise that had gone sideways when Taliban fighters had managed to infiltrate the perimeter. While base security had scrambled to contain the threat, Richardson had calmly organized a counterattack that had saved dozens of lives. Later, over lukewarm coffee in the officers' club, he told her about his daughter back in Virginia Beach. 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, obsessed with butterflies and convinced her daddy was a superhero. "Richardson's down there," she said into her helmet microphone, not caring if Colonel Webb was still monitoring their frequency. The F-15 leveled off at 800 feet above ground level, low enough that she could see individual boulders and scraggly mountain vegetation rushing past her wingtips. At this altitude, they were vulnerable to everything from rifle fire to rocket-propelled grenades, but it was the only way to deliver accurate close air support without risking the lives of the trapped SEALs. Morrison's hands moved across his displays with mechanical precision. Target acquired. Machine gun nest, bearing 047, range 1,800 meters. Hellfire locked and loaded. The Lockheed Martin AGM-114 Hellfire missile weighed barely over 100 pounds, but its tandem heat warhead could penetrate armor plating and reduce a fortified position to smoking rubble in milliseconds. Below them, the valley floor erupted in muzzle flashes as the enemy fighters adjusted their positions. Katerina could see the compound now, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by low walls that provided minimal cover for the trapped Americans. Thermal imaging revealed 6 heat signatures huddled behind what appeared to be a collapsed section of wall. 6 signatures that represented 6 men with families, friends, dreams, and fears. 6 men whose lives now depended on the flying skills of a woman they'd probably never met, piloted by someone half the military establishment still considered a diversity hire rather than a warrior. The threat warning system screamed again as another SAM site locked onto their aircraft. This one was closer, probably hidden in the rocks less than a mile from their position. Modern surface-to-air missiles traveled at 3 times the speed of sound, faster than human reaction time, faster than countermeasures, faster than prayer. But Katerina Volkov had spent her entire career dancing with death at altitudes where mistakes were measured in milliseconds, and survival depended on instincts honed through thousands of hours in the cockpit. She rolled the F-15 inverted and pulled hard, the G-forces crushing her down into her ejection seat with the weight of 4 men. The horizon tumbled wildly through her canopy as the fighter corkscrewed toward the valley floor, bleeding altitude and energy in a maneuver that would have impressed even the Thunderbird's demonstration team. Behind her, Morrison grunted against the crushing acceleration, his vision graying at the edges as blood struggled to reach his brain. The missile launch signature bloomed on their threat display like a malevolent star. Somewhere in the rocks below, a Taliban fighter had just fired a shoulder-launched SAM at their aircraft. The weapon streaked upward at nearly Mach 3, its infrared seeker head locked onto the heat signature of their twin engines. Time compressed into a series of crystalline moments where training, instinct, and sheer bloody-minded determination would determine whether they lived or died in the next 10 seconds. Missile launch, Morrison called out unnecessarily. They could both see the threat symbol racing toward them on their displays. The computer calculated impact in 7 seconds. 6. 5. Katerina waited until the last possible moment, then yanked the stick hard right and triggered another salvo of flares. The F-15 responded like a thoroughbred, rolling 90 degrees and diving toward a narrow canyon that split the mountainside like a wound. The missile detonated 200 feet behind them, its proximity fuse triggered by the flare decoys. Shrapnel rattled against their aircraft's titanium skin like deadly hail, but the Strike Eagle was built to absorb punishment. Designed during the Cold War to penetrate Soviet air defenses and deliver nuclear weapons to targets deep inside Russia, the F-15E could survive damage that would cripple lesser aircraft. They emerged from the canyon at barely 300 feet above the valley floor, the compound directly ahead. Through her targeting system, Katerina could see individual figures moving between the buildings. Enemy fighters repositioning their weapons, unaware that death was approaching at 500 knots. The machine gun nest Morrison had identified was clearly visible now, a sandbagged position built into the rocks with interlocking fields of fire that covered the entire compound. No wonder the SEALs were pinned down. Fox 3, Morrison announced calmly, using the brevity code for Hellfire missile launch. The weapon separated from its pylon with a metallic thunk, its rocket motor igniting a fraction of a second later. The missile streaked across the valley in a nearly flat trajectory, its laser guidance system locked onto the machine gun position with mechanical precision. The explosion lit up the pre-dawn darkness like a miniature sun. The machine gun nest simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a cloud of pulverized rock and superheated metal. But there were at least 3 more heavy weapons positions scattered around the ridgeline, and their ammunition would only last so long. Katerina banked hard left, lining up for another attack run while scanning the terrain for additional threats. The radio crackled with Richardson's voice again, stronger now but still strained with pain and exhaustion. Unknown aircraft, this is Neptune 6. That was beautiful work, but we've got more company incoming from the north. Estimate 24 fighters, maybe more. The transmission was punctuated by the distinctive crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of grenades exploding. More fighters. The Taliban had reinforced their ambush, probably calling in every available man from surrounding villages. What had started as a surgical extraction mission was turning into a running gun battle that could drag on for hours. And with each passing minute, the enemy anti-aircraft defenses would become more organized, more deadly. Already, Katerina could see additional heat signatures moving along the ridgelines, fighters carrying portable SAM launchers and heavy machine guns. Colonel Webb's voice cut through the chaos like an Arctic wind. Ghost Rider, you are ordered to cease engagement and return to base immediately. That is a direct order. Acknowledge. The tone carried 30 years of military authority and barely contained fury. In the rigid hierarchy of military command, a major simply did not ignore orders from a full colonel, especially not a major with a history of what personnel files diplomatically termed independent decision-making. Katerina keyed her radio once, the brief transmission acknowledging that she'd heard the order. But acknowledgement wasn't the same as compliance, and she had no intention of abandoning Richardson and his team. The F-15 climbed steeply, gaining altitude for another attack run while Morrison reconfigured their weapon systems. They had 4 more Hellfires, two 500-pound bombs, and nearly 1,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition. Enough firepower to level a city block, if used properly. But firepower alone wouldn't save the SEALs. They needed extraction, medical attention, and air cover for at least another hour until rescue helicopters could reach the valley. An hour was an eternity in aerial combat, especially against an enemy that was learning their tactics with each attack run. The Taliban fighters weren't the ragtag militia that American politicians like to portray on television. Many were veterans of decades of warfare, men who'd fought the Soviets, fought each other, and now fought the Americans with the same grim determination that had made Afghanistan the graveyard of empires. The second attack run took them in from the west, using a ridge line to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Morrison had identified another heavy weapons position, this one a recoilless rifle crew that had been lobbing high-explosive shells into the compound. The weapon was capable of punching through concrete walls and turning human beings into scattered fragments, but its crew had made the mistake of positioning themselves in the open where thermal imaging could track their movement. "Target acquired," Morrison reported. "Recoilless rifle position, bearing 180, range 1,200 meters." His voice had taken on the mechanical calm of a man completely focused on his job. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford at moments like this, when split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The second Hellfire missile streaked across the valley like a bolt of lightning, its warhead detonating with pinpoint accuracy among the enemy crew. The recoilless rifle tumbled end over end down the mountainside, its operators reduced to scattered remains that would never be recovered or identified. But even as one threat was eliminated, others were taking its place. The thermal imaging system showed dozens of heat signatures moving through the rocks, a coordinated assault that threatened to overwhelm the trapped SEALs through sheer weight of numbers. Richardson's voice came through the radio again, weaker now but still steady. "Ghost, we've got wounded down here. Real bad. If you've got any magic tricks, now would be a good time." The understated professionalism of Special Operations Forces, where admitting to real bad casualties probably meant someone was dying. These were men trained to fight through injuries that would incapacitate ordinary soldiers, men who wouldn't call for help unless the situation was truly desperate. Katerina felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced 3 years ago when her brother's Apache had disappeared into these same mountains. The search and rescue mission had lasted 4 days, with multiple aircraft scouring every canyon and valley for any sign of the downed helicopter. They'd found wreckage scattered across a mile of mountainous terrain, aluminum fragments and plexiglass shards mixed with personal effects that had somehow survived the impact. But they'd never found bodies, never found answers, never found closure. Her brother Dmitri had been the golden child of the Volkov family, the one who'd inherited their father's mechanical genius and their mother's fierce determination. He taught her to fly before she was old enough for a driver's license, taking her up in a borrowed Cessna 150 and letting her take the controls while he dozed in the right seat. "Flying is like breathing," he told her during one of those early lessons. "Stop thinking about it and just let your body remember what it knows." Now she was alone in the cockpit of a fighter jet, responsible for the lives of 6 men she'd never met but whose blood would stain her conscience forever if she failed them. The mountains below looked exactly the same as they had 3 years ago, unchanging and indifferent to human suffering. But Katerina Volkov had changed. The uncertain young pilot who'd flown search patterns through these valleys had been replaced by someone harder, colder, more focused on the mission than on the politics that surrounded it. "Radar, how much ordnance do we have left?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from her heads-up display. Morrison ran through their remaining weapons inventory with the precision of an accountant. 4 Hellfire missiles, 2 500-pound JDAMs, and 847 rounds of 20mm ammunition. Enough to keep fighting for another 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they were careful with their shots. but 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours if rescue helicopters couldn't reach the valley. The nearest American base was Bagram, nearly 200 miles away across some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan. Even if rescue birds launched immediately, they wouldn't arrive for at least an hour, probably longer if they had to coordinate with ground forces and establish a secure landing zone. An hour, 60 minutes of continuous combat against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reinforcements and increasingly sophisticated air defense systems. The Taliban had learned from 15 years of fighting American air power, adapting their tactics and equipment to neutralize the technological advantages that had once made close air support missions routine rather than suicidal. The third attack run targeted a cluster of fighters who'd been maneuvering to flank the compound from the east. They moved with the disciplined coordination of experienced infantry, using cover and concealment to approach the SEAL position while maintaining mutual fire support. These weren't the desperate villagers or foreign volunteers that made up much of the Taliban rank and file. These were professionals, possibly former Afghan army soldiers who'd switched sides, or Pakistani Special Services Group operators who'd crossed the border to support their Taliban allies. Morrison's targeting system tracked the enemy fighters as they bounded from rock to rock, their heat signatures clearly visible against the cooling mountain terrain. The 20mm cannon was the weapon of choice for this engagement. Its high rate of fire and devastating impact effects perfect for suppressing infantry in the open. Each shell was the size of a man's thumb, tipped with depleted uranium, and capable of punching through light armor or reducing human targets to unrecognizable fragments. "Gun, gun, gun," Morrison called out as Katerina triggered the Vulcan cannon. The weapon roared to life with a sound like ripping canvas, spitting out a stream of shells at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The impacts marched across the mountainside in a deadly line, each explosion throwing up clouds of pulverized rock and organic matter. The flanking attack dissolved under the withering fire, survivors scrambling for cover among the boulders while their dead and wounded were left scattered across the open ground. But the cannon run had exposed them to counterfire from multiple directions. The F-15 shuddered as small arms rounds sparked off its armored skin, most deflecting harmlessly, but some finding gaps in the protection. A red warning light flickered on Katerina's instrument panel, indicating minor hydraulic damage that would require immediate attention once they returned to base. If they returned to base. The radio came alive with multiple voices, a confused babble of American and Pashto transmissions that painted a chaotic picture of the developing battle. Richardson's team was still holding their position, but casualties were mounting and ammunition was running low. The Taliban reinforcements were deploying heavy weapons that could punch through the mud brick walls of the compound, turning their defensive position into a death trap. And somewhere in the mountains around them, additional SAM teams were moving into position for coordinated attacks that could overwhelm even the most sophisticated countermeasures. Colonel Webb's voice cut through the radio chatter like a sword through silk. "Ghost Rider, this is Overwatch. Be advised that Pakistani Air Force F-16s have been scrambled from Jacobabad. Estimated time to your position, 15 minutes. Recommend immediate egress to avoid international incident." The words carried implications that went far beyond a simple tactical situation. Pakistan was officially an American ally, but their intelligence services maintained close ties with the Taliban. F-16s approaching the battle zone could mean anything from a coincidental patrol to active intervention on behalf of the enemy fighters. 15 minutes. Not enough time to eliminate all the threats around the compound, but too long to ignore the approaching Pakistani fighters. The F-16 Fighting Falcon was no match for an F-15 in air-to-air combat, but 4 Pakistani jets working together could present a serious threat, especially if the Americans were distracted by ground support missions. And any engagement with Pakistani forces would create a diplomatic crisis that could destabilize the entire region. Katerina felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her like the G-forces during a high-speed maneuver. Abandon Richardson and his team to save her own aircraft and avoid an international incident, or continue the mission and risk triggering a confrontation that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. The mathematics of warfare had become infinitely more complex, with variables that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. But mathematics meant nothing to the men dying in the compound below. Richardson had a daughter who collected butterflies and believed her father was invincible. The other team members had families, wives, children, parents who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what had happened in a remote valley in Afghanistan. They joined the military to serve their country, not to become acceptable losses in someone else's political calculations. Radar, give me a tactical assessment. How many more targets can we service before those F-16s arrive? Katerina's voice carried the calm authority of a pilot who'd already made her decision. The diplomatic consequences would sort themselves out later, assuming she lived long enough to face a court-martial. Right now, 6 Americans needed air support, and she was the only pilot in position to provide it. Morrison's voice was steady as he ran the calculations. I count at least 8 more heavy weapons positions, plus an estimated 40 to 50 individual fighters. With current ordnance load, we can maybe take out half the heavy weapons before Winchester. Winchester was pilot slang for running out of ammunition, the point where an aircraft became nothing more than an expensive observer platform. 8 heavy weapons positions. Mortars, recoilless rifles, heavy machine guns, possibly even shoulder-fired rockets that could turn the compound into a smoking crater. Each position represented a lethal threat to the trapped SEALs, but eliminating them would require precision strikes that expended ammunition at an unsustainable rate. And all the while, Pakistani F-16s were approaching from the east, their pilots probably receiving orders that were equally complex and contradictory. The fourth attack run took them in from the north, following a dry riverbed that provided natural concealment until they were within striking distance of their targets. Morrison had identified a mortar crew that had been dropping high-explosive shells uncomfortably close to the compound, adjusting their fire with each salvo to walk their rounds onto target. The 82mm mortar was a simple but effective weapon, capable of delivering devastating firepower with minimal training and equipment. But simplicity worked both ways. The mortar crew had positioned themselves in a natural depression that provided excellent protection from direct fire, but made them sitting ducks for aerial attack. The Hellfire missile struck the center of their position with surgical precision, the explosion obliterating the weapon and its crew in a microsecond of superheated destruction. 7 heavy weapons positions remaining. 13 minutes until the Pakistani F-16s arrived, and the enemy fighters were learning to adapt their tactics, spreading out to minimize the effectiveness of each airstrike and using the terrain to mask their movements. The next few minutes would determine whether the SEALs lived to see another sunrise or became another classified casualty report buried in Pentagon filing systems. Richardson's voice crackled through the radio static, weaker now but still coherent. Ghost, you're doing God's work up there, but we're running low on everything down here. Ammo, medical supplies, time. Whatever you're planning, better make it count. The transmission carried undertones that veteran warriors recognized immediately. Richardson was preparing his team for a final stand, the last desperate moments when training and equipment gave way to raw courage and stubborn refusal to surrender. Katerina felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. These men had never asked to be heroes. They'd simply volunteered for a dangerous job and found themselves trapped in an impossible situation through no fault of their own. The mission that had brought them to this valley was probably classified above her pay grade. Some intelligence operation or counterterrorism strike that existed only in the files of people who would never hear the sound of incoming mortar rounds or smell the cordite smoke of a firefight. But heroism wasn't about choosing to be in the right place at the right time. It was about making the right choice when you found yourself there anyway. And sometimes, the right choice meant ignoring orders, defying authority, and accepting consequences that could destroy a career or worse. Her father had made similar choices during his service in the Soviet Army, small acts of conscience that had eventually forced him to flee his homeland with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to build a better life for his children. "Dmitri, if you're watching this, I hope you're proud," she whispered into her helmet microphone, knowing that her brother's ghost was somewhere in these mountains, another casualty of America's longest war. The admission was barely audible even to herself, but Morrison heard it through the intercom system. "He would be," came the quiet response from her weapons systems officer. "Hell, we all would be." The words carried more weight than formal medals or commendations, the simple acknowledgement of one warrior to another that courage had been recognized and honored. The fifth attack run targeted multiple positions simultaneously, using the F-15's sophisticated targeting system to engage 3 separate heavy weapons emplacements with precision-guided munitions. The attacks had to be perfectly timed, striking all 3 targets within seconds of each other to prevent the surviving crews from taking effective countermeasures. It was the kind of complex engagement that required absolute coordination between pilot and weapons officer, the sort of maneuver that looked effortless when performed by experts, but could turn catastrophic if either crew member made the smallest mistake. Morrison's hands danced across his control panels like a pianist performing a difficult concerto, designating targets and programming weapons while monitoring their rapidly diminishing ammunition supply. 3 more Hellfire missiles separated from their pylons in rapid succession, each weapon guided by its own laser designator toward a different target. The explosions rippled across the mountainside like a deadly thunder, eliminating 3 more threats in the space of 10 seconds. But success came at a cost. The coordinated attack had required them to maintain a steady flight path for nearly 30 seconds, making them vulnerable to the surface-to-air missiles that had been tracking their movements throughout the engagement. The threat warning system screamed as multiple SAM sites acquired firing solutions, their radar beams painting the F-15 with electromagnetic energy that felt as tangible as physical contact. Multiple locks," Morrison called out unnecessarily. They could both see the threat symbols multiplying on their displays like malevolent stars. At least 6 different missile systems had acquired their aircraft, creating an interlocking web of destruction that would be nearly impossible to evade. The enemy had been patient, allowing the Americans to complete their attacks while positioning SAM launchers for a coordinated salvo that could overwhelm any countermeasures. Time compressed into a series of crystalline moments where physics, technology, and human skill intersected in ways that would determine life or death. Katerina's hands moved with unconscious precision, deploying countermeasures while throwing the F-15 into a defensive maneuver that pushed both aircraft and crew to their operational limits. G-forces crushed them down into their seats as the fighter twisted through 3 dimensions, bleeding energy and altitude in a desperate attempt to break the missile locks. The first SAM detonated 200 feet below them, its proximity fuse triggered by chaff decoys, but still close enough to pepper their aircraft with shrapnel. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel as secondary systems took damage, but the Strike Eagle's redundant design kept flying even as individual components failed. The second missile overshot their position, confused by flare decoys that burned hotter than their jet engines, and sent the weapon tumbling harmlessly into the valley floor. But the third missile found its mark. The impact felt like being hit by a freight train traveling at the speed of sound. The F-15 lurched sideways as the warhead detonated against their port engine intake, the explosion shredding turbine blades and turning precision machinery into twisted metal fragments. Fire warning lights blazed across the cockpit as burning fuel sprayed from ruptured fuel lines, creating a comet tail of flame that stretched behind them like a banner advertising their vulnerability. "Engine fire, port side," Morrison reported with professional calm that belied the seriousness of their situation. His hands moved automatically through emergency procedures, shutting down fuel flow to the damaged engine while monitoring their remaining systems for additional failures. The F-15 was designed to fly on a single engine, but their combat effectiveness had just been cut in half and their fuel consumption had increased dramatically. Katerina fought to maintain control as the damaged fighter yawed heavily to the left, the asymmetric thrust trying to flip them into an unrecoverable spin. Her feet worked the rudder pedals while her hands made constant corrections to the flight controls, using every ounce of her training and experience to keep them airborne. The mountains rushed past their wingtips with terrifying proximity, close enough that she could see individual rocks and scrub vegetation in the pre-dawn gloom. "Ghost, we're showing major damage to your aircraft," came Richardson's voice through the radio static. The SEAL commander had been monitoring their engagement, watching the aerial battle unfold above his position while fighting his own desperate struggle for survival. "Say your status." Status? What was their status? One engine destroyed, fuel leaking, multiple systems failures, ammunition running low, and Pakistani F-16s approaching their position in less than 8 minutes. By any rational measure, they should be heading for the nearest friendly base at maximum speed, hopping to reach safety before their remaining engine failed or enemy fighters intercepted them. But rational measures didn't account for 6 Americans trapped in a compound below, Americans who would die without continued air support. "We're still in the fight," Katerina replied, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. The F-15 had settled into stable flight on its remaining engine, though their maneuverability was severely compromised, and their fuel consumption was climbing toward critical levels. They had maybe 20 minutes of flight time remaining, 30 if she throttled back to minimum power settings that would make them even more vulnerable to ground fire. Morrison was already recalculating their weapons employment options, working with reduced electrical power and damaged targeting systems to determine what ordnance they could still deliver effectively. "We've got 1 Hellfire left, 2 JDAMs, and about 600 rounds of 20 mic. Targeting pod is damaged but functional, laser designator operational." The clinical recitation of their remaining capabilities sounded almost absurd given their circumstances, like an accountant reviewing quarterly projections while the building burned down around him. 1 Hellfire missile, 2 500-pound bombs, 600 rounds of cannon ammunition, enough firepower to level several city blocks if used properly, but barely adequate to address the threats still surrounding the trapped SEALs. And every minute they remained in the battle space increased the likelihood that enemy fighters would overwhelm their defenses or mechanical failures would force them down among the same mountains that had claimed so many other aircraft over the decades. The 6th attack run took them directly over the compound at barely 500 feet altitude, low enough that Richardson and his team could see the battle damage scarring their aircraft's fuselage. The damaged F-15 responded sluggishly to her control inputs, requiring constant attention to maintain straight and level flight. But the low altitude gave Morrison a perfect view of the remaining enemy positions, thermal signatures standing out clearly against the cooling mountain terrain. "I've got eyes on what looks like a command post," he reported, his voice tight with concentration as he worked with degraded systems to lock onto the target. 2 buildings, northeast of your position, maybe 800 meters. Multiple antennas, vehicle park, definitely high value. Command posts were critical nodes in any enemy network, coordination centers where intelligence was processed and orders were disseminated. Eliminating the command structure could disrupt the entire enemy operation, buying precious time for rescue helicopters to reach the valley. But the command post was also the most heavily defended target they'd encountered, surrounded by multiple anti-aircraft weapons, and positioned in terrain that limited their attack options. The approach would require flying straight into the teeth of the enemy's air defense network, through interlocking fields of fire from weapons that had been specifically positioned to deny American aircraft access to high-value targets. "Your call, Ghost," Morrison said quietly, acknowledging that the decision ultimately rested with the aircraft commander. He'd done his job, identifying targets and providing tactical recommendations. But the choice between mission accomplishment and crew survival belonged to the pilot, the final authority in any aircrew regardless of rank or experience levels. Katerina felt the weight of that responsibility settling across her shoulders like a lead blanket. Every pilot eventually faced moments where technical skill gave way to moral choice, where training manuals provided no guidance for the decisions that would define the rest of their careers. Her instructors at the Air Force Academy had tried to prepare her for such moments, but academic discussions of ethics and leadership bore no resemblance to the reality of combat where wrong choices killed people and right choices sometimes killed them anyway. Below them, Richardson's team was fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. Above them, Pakistani F-16s were approaching with unknown intentions and possibly hostile orders. Around them, enemy fighters were repositioning heavy weapons for attacks that could eliminate the trapped Americans in the next few minutes. And in her damaged aircraft, fuel gauges steadily unwound toward empty, while warning lights painted the cockpit in shades of amber and red. The mathematics of survival suggested immediate withdrawal to the nearest friendly base, accepting the loss of 6 special operations personnel in exchange for preserving a multi-million-dollar aircraft and 2 highly trained aircrew members. The mathematics of warfare supported that calculation, trading known losses for probable gains according to formulas developed by strategists who measured victory in statistical abstractions rather than individual lives. But Katerina Volkov had never been particularly good at mathematics. She'd earned her place in an F-15 cockpit through stubborn determination and an absolute refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose on her. The same determination that had driven her father to flee Soviet oppression, the same refusal that had motivated her brother to volunteer for the most dangerous missions in the Apache fleet. "Light up that command post," she said into her helmet microphone, banking the damaged fighter toward the heavily defended target. "Let's see if we can ruin someone's morning." The final approach took them through a gauntlet of ground fire that turned the pre-dawn sky into a deadly constellation of tracer rounds and explosive shells. The F-15 shuddered under multiple impacts as small arms fire found gaps in their armor, each hit sending metallic fragments rattling through the cockpit like deadly hail. Warning systems screamed continuously now, their electronic voices adding to the chaos of combat communications and engine noise. Morrison's targeting system locked onto the command post with mechanical precision, designating the largest building in the complex for their last Hellfire missile. The weapon was designed to penetrate hardened targets and detonate inside them, using a tandem warhead that could punch through concrete walls in a blitz.